Over the years, her tale of brutality has grown and shifted, and today it's difficult to discern fact from fiction in the story of Delphine La Laurie and her house of horrors. Born in 1775 to Bartholomew Lewis McCarty and Marie Jean Lovable, the McCartys were prominent among New Orleans society, having emigrated to the Big Easy from Ireland in the 1730s. The extent to which slavery impacted Delphine's early life is difficult to tell. Some accounts say that her mother was killed by a slave, other accounts say it was her father, while others still say that it was her uncle that was killed. Indeed, another version states that her family was affected by the slave revolt of 1811. In any event, none of these are confirmed by any objective sources. One authority says that she was 14 when she first got married. However, it's more likely that she wed her first husband, Don Ramon de Lopez y Anguilo, a Spanish officer of high rank, in 1800, when she was about 24. Together, they had one daughter before Don Ramon died, sometime around 1804. Again, there is disagreement, or just perhaps bad maths, over when she married her second husband, Jean Blanc. One authority notes that she was 20, while others set a date at 1808. Regardless, Jean was a catch. He was a banker, a lawyer, a merchant, and a legislator, and together they had 4 children before he also died in 1816. In 1825, Louis La Laurie moved to New Orleans from Paris, having studied medicine at the Sorbonne. Introducing himself to the community, he announced in the New Orleans Courier that a French physician has just arrived in this city who is acquainted with the means, lately discovered in France, of destroying hunches, humped backs. By this time, Delphine, she was pretty wealthy, having inheritance from her parents as well as her 2 dead husbands. Despite being significantly older than La Laurie, she was about 50, the two struck up a relationship. At least one account states that he knocked her up and that the two married 5 months after the child was born. If you're wondering how, given her age, well, this version holds that she was 38 at the time, in 1826, but that maths doesn't compute with her birth year. Regardless, all sources agree that Delphine and La Laurie ultimately married, with Delphine bringing significantly more wealth to her third marriage. As such, she purchased the property where the torture occurred, 1140 Royal Street, and most accounts say that she managed the construction of the 3-story mansion on the premises. In order to run the opulent home and manage her busy social events, Delphine had a lot of slaves. By some accounts, between 1816 and 1834, she had at least 54 of them. Stories differ about when New Orleans society became wise to Delphine's cruelty. All versions agree that no hints of mistreatment arose prior to her marriage to La Laurie. Some state that by 1828 there were rumors of barbarous treatment and that her slaves were only given the barest of necessities. In at least one version, at some point she was criminally charged but acquitted of cruelty to her slaves. Most historians agree that sometime before the horrific day, Delphine, brandishing a whip, chased a slave girl off the roof of her mansion, with the child falling to her death. Some assert that after this incident, Delphine was shunned by New Orleans society, but documented accounts of this didn't happen until after her torture chamber was discovered. Not perhaps completely evil, however, on 2 different occasions, 1818 and 1832, Delphine is known to have emancipated 2 slaves. This brings us to April 10, 1834, when a fire broke out in the kitchen of the mansion. Some authorities hold that the cook was actually chained to the stove when the fire started, and a few say that the neighbors were aware of this. The cook later supposedly claimed that she started the fire intending to commit suicide rather than submit to Delphine's punishments that took place in the attic, a place no slave up to this point had returned from. Regardless, seeing the fire, neighbors entered the mansion, knowing that slaves were locked in the uppermost room, and neighbors implored the La Lauries to let them remove them, but they were rebuffed, with La Laurie refusing to give them a key. One of the neighbors, Judge Cannonage, disregarded the La Lauries, and the group broke down one of the locked doors to the attic rooms, revealing the horror within. Emancipated slaves with obvious signs of beatings were covered with scars and chained up. At least 7 of them were more or less horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. The judge also stated that he saw a, to quote him, negress wearing an iron collar and an old Negro woman who had received a very deep wound on her head, too weak to be able to walk. From here, it's difficult to separate fact from fiction. In some accounts, some of the slaves wore spikes that prevented them from moving their heads. It's also reported that slaves had been flayed with a whip. In at least one account, the slaves were nude, and some were held in cages, while others were tethered to operating tables. Many had signs of having been elaborately tortured and mutilated. One authority relies on this last account to posit the possibility that the room was actually controlled by Dr. La Laurie, who was conducting experiments on the slaves in order to develop better medical procedures. Although this version is not well accepted, it is reported that when the judge questioned him about the condition of the slaves, Dr. La Laurie replied, "Some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business." Whatever the case, those slaves who had been tortured were put on display at a local jail, and the New Orleans Bee reported that within 2 days, 4,000 people went to witness the suffering for themselves. The condition of the slaves must have been as bad as advertised, because a mob subsequently ransacked the Royal Street mansion, driving out Dr. and Madame La Laurie. After they had fled, the Pittsfield Sun wrote a story noting that exhumations on the mansion's grounds revealed many corpses, including that of a child. Little is known of the rest of her life, but Delphine is believed to have fled to Paris, where she lived the remainder of her days. Many accounts set the year of her death at 1842, but she may have lived as late as 1849. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up below. And don't forget to comment to let us know how we're doing on this new channel. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, do subscribe, all of that good stuff. And as always, thank you for watching.